Mark Higgins floored the old pickup, feeling the engine purr under the hood like an old dog who still remembered how to growl, but not as fiercely as in his youth, and this purr mingled with the hum of the tires on the asphalt, which at this hour of the evening, with the sun already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rust and smoke, seemed to him an endless ribbon leading straight to the house, where Rachel was waiting with her eternal smile, as predictable as his workday in the workshop, full of the smells of machine oil and metal. He'd just finished his shift, his hands still stained black from the grease he'd tried to wipe off with a rag, but it was ingrained in his skin like memories of a time when life had seemed simpler, when he could fix anything with just a glance and a few tools, and now here he was, tired but not broken, thinking about how Trevor, their son, was probably home by now, buried in his phone or his textbooks, trying to figure out algebra or whatever it was that plagued teenagers at school, and the thought sent a warm wave through him because Trevor was the anchor that kept him afloat in this ocean of routine. The road wound through an industrial area, past warehouses with peeling paint and factories with smoke wriggling like snakes from their chimneys, and Mark turned on the radio to drown out his thoughts. But the station picked up some old rock ballad with a guitar moaning about a lost love, and he snorted, switching to the news, where the announcer was monotonously talking about some fire in the center of town. But Mark wasn't listening because his mind was occupied with something else, that slight, almost imperceptible feeling that something was wrong, as if there was a gear creaking in the mechanism of his life that he hadn't had time to examine yet. Suddenly there was a horn behind him, sharp and insistent, like a needle jabbing into his skin, and Mark glanced in the rearview mirror to see the flashing headlights of a sedan passing him on the left, the driver gesturing down at the wheels, and Mark felt his heart skip a beat, not from fear, but from the kind of irritated frustration that builds after a long day when all you want is to get home and shower and sit down to dinner, but the world has decided to throw another little curvy ball at you. He slowed down, feeling the car sway slightly, and yes, he could hear it now, a swishing sound like a tire rubbing the wrong way on the pavement, and he cursed under his breath as he pulled into the nearest parking lot of an abandoned supermarket, where the pavement was as cracked as an old man's skin and the lights were blinking yellow, casting shadows that seemed longer than they should be at this hour. The truck lurched to a stop and Mark turned off the engine, sitting in silence for a minute, listening to the engine cool and trying to collect his thoughts, because this wasn't just a flat tire. This was like a sign, like a warning from fate, that small failures accumulate, layer upon layer, until they become something bigger, a cup that is about to overflow, and he didn't know why that thought was so persistently creeping into his head. But it was there, like a nail in the sole of a shoe that you can feel but can't pull out right away. He stepped out of the cab, the air cool and tasting of rain that was about to fall from the sky, and walked around the truck, crouching by the right rear tire where the tire was flat, as if someone had deliberately stuck something sharp in it, and Mark ran his hand over the rubber, feeling the cold metal under his fingers. Yes, a nail, big and rusty, sticking out like a mockery of his profession as a technician who fixed other people's cars but couldn't fix his own life as easily. He straightened up. Looking around, the parking lot was empty, just cars driving along the highway in the distance, their headlights cutting the dusk like knives, and the wind was stirring the trash along the curb, plastic bags and newspaper scraps that swirled in a little vortex, reminding him of the chaos that was always waiting around the corner. Mark opened the trunk, taking out the jack and the spare tire. The movements were automatic, honed by years of working in the garage, where he spent more time than at home, fixing engines that roared under his hands like wild animals, and it gave him a sense of control, because in the world of machines everything was logical. A bolt tightens, a gear falls into place, and everything works, unlike people who could smile to your face and behind your back do something that corroded your soul like acid corrodes metal. He thought about Rachel, how distant she had become lately. Her smiles were the same, kind, like an office manager used to clients, but there was something cold in her eyes, like ice in a glass of whiskey, and Mark pushed these thoughts away because they were stupid, the paranoia of a tired man, but they still came back, like that nail that someone had probably thrown on the road on purpose to ruin his evening. As he lifted the jack, Mark felt his backache age was catching up with him, 45, no longer a boy, but still strong, with hands covered in scars from tools and burns, and he remembered how in his youth he could lift a car with one hand, well, almost, and now he groaned like an old man, and it irritated him, because he had always been proud of his strength, that balanced aggression that helped him in his work when he needed to break a rusty bolt or convince a client that the repair was worth the money. He positioned the jack under the frame, starting to turn the handle, and the truck rose slowly, creaking as if it were complaining about the process, and Mark thought about Trevor, how his son had become withdrawn lately, talking less at dinner, lost in his own world, and Mark blamed it on school, on adolescence, on all these gadgets. But deep down he knew it was the atmosphere of the house, the silence that hung between him and Rachel like the smoke from a cigarette that no one was smoking, but the smell was still in the air. The wheel rose and Mark took the wrench, unscrewing the nuts one by one, each one resisting, as if it didn't want to let go, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back despite the cool of the evening, and anxiety was growing, like a cloud that darkens overhead, but you can't tell if it's going to rain or just pass by. Memories flashed through his mind how he and Rachel had met, in a bar by the harbor where he was fixing boat engines, and she was working in a small office organizing supplies, and her laugh had been so genuine that he had fallen in love immediately, married a year later, and Trevor had been born as a gift. But now, years later, everything had changed. She was spending more time at work, coming home tired in the evenings, smelling of someone else's cologne, which she explained as meetings with clients, and Mark believed because he wanted to believe. But this anxiety, this damn anxiety, it gnawed at him from the inside, like termites on wood, and he couldn't figure out where it came from, maybe from fatigue, from routine, from the fact that life had become as predictable as the route this pickup took on its way home. The nuts came off and Mark pulled the wheel off, rolling it to the side where it lay flat and useless on the asphalt, and he stared at the nails sticking out of the tread, rusty and sharp-pointed, and thought about how such a small thing could stop the whole mechanism, just as the little disagreements in a marriage could accumulate and tear a hole in trust. But he pushed the thought away because it was too dangerous, too close to something he didn't want to acknowledge. As Mark was installing the spare tire, he heard a noise as a car passed the parking lot, slowing, and he looked up to see a silhouette in the window, but it was just a random driver, probably curious, and Mark snorted as he continued to work, tightening the nuts with more force than was necessary because there was anger building inside him, contained as always, but ready to burst out like steam from a pressurized boiler. He thought of Jerry, the social worker Rachel had mentioned a couple of times, a colleague on some project, a smug, charismatic guy who probably told jokes around the office and everyone laughed. But Mark had never met him. He had only heard the name, and for some reason it stuck in his mind like that nail in the tire. But he didn't pursue the thought because that would be stupid, paranoid, and instead focused on his work, feeling his muscles tense and his mind wandering through mazes of doubt. Lowering the jack, Mark felt relief the truck stood on all four wheels, and he put the tools back in the trunk, wiping his hands on his pants, leaving black marks, and stood, looking at the road, where cars continued to rush, indifferent to his little drama. The anxiety did not go away. It sat in his chest like a stone, and he could not understand why it was just a wheel, a minor failure, but against the background of something greater, like a drop that overflows the cup, and Mark sat back in the cabin, starting the engine, which purred obediently, but in his head echoed questions that had no answers, and he drove on, not knowing that this night was only beginning to unravel the thread leading to madness. But for now he just drove, feeling the wind through the open window on his face, and tried to convince himself that everything was okay, that the anxiety was just tiredness, but deep down he knew it wasn't, that the nail in the wheel was just the beginning, a symbol of something that was already cracked in his life, and he couldn't fix it as easily as a tire. Mark turned the wheel, pulling out of the parking lot, and the road stretched forward again, but now every turn felt like a trap. Every headlight felt like a gaze following him, and he clenched his jaw, fighting the feeling because he was a level-headed man, a techie who solved problems logically, step by step. But logic didn't work here, because the problem wasn't in the mechanism, it was in the heart, in that part of the soul where the demons of rage and doubt hid. He remembered the morning, Rachel kissing him goodbye, but it had been a quick, mechanical kiss, as if she were performing a ritual rather than expressing love, and Trevor had sat at the table, chewing toast, his eyes down, and the atmosphere had been heavy, like before a thunderstorm. But Mark had gone to work without saying anything, because words might destroy the delicate balance, and now, on this road, he regretted it, because silence was accumulating like dust on shelves, and one day it might suffocate everything alive. The truck picked up speed and Mark turned on the headlights because the dusk was deepening, painting the world in noir tones where the shadows were long and the truth was hidden, and he could feel the conflict growing inside him, the struggle between the desire to believe and the fear of knowing the truth. But for now he was just driving home, unaware that this small setback was just the first domino in a chain that was about to fall. And yet, at that moment, sitting behind the wheel, Mark tried to push away the anxiety, convincing himself that it was just paranoia, but it clung like a nail in rubber, and he knew that sooner or later he would have to face what was lurking beneath the surface. Mark Higgins sat in the cab of his pickup truck, parked at the edge of a lot where the asphalt was as cracked as his patience and the lights flickered yellow, winking at the growing anxiety that was gripping his chest like a vice as he waited for the sealant in his new tire to set, because his spare wasn't perfect, and he didn't want to risk driving home on a flat, especially after a nail had, like a twist of fate, punctured his plans for a quiet evening. The air was cool, with the taste of impending rain, and Mark left the window cracked open to let in the fresh air that he hoped would cool his head, but instead it only served to intensify the feeling that the world around him was tightening like a spring about to snap. He glanced at his watch, 7:43 p.m., too late for dinner, which Rachel had probably already heated up, if she'd even remembered it, rather than staying for another meeting with colleagues, which had become so frequent lately that he'd stopped asking questions, afraid to hear answers that might confirm his worst suspicions. Mark leaned back in his seat, feeling the skin of his back stick to the old upholstery, soaked in the smell of gasoline and his own sweat, and tried to focus on the sound of the radio, where the anchor droned on about the traffic jams downtown. But his mind wandered, returning to that nail, that small setback that seemed like the harbinger of something bigger, like the first crack in the foundation of a house before it collapses. He pulled out his phone to check if Trevor had texted him, but the screen was blank, just the wallpaper, an old photo of the three of them, him and Rachel and Trevor, standing on the beach, smiling, the sun shining so brightly it felt like another lifetime, when they were still a family and not three people living under the same roof, but in different worlds. Mark sighed, putting the phone away, and his gaze fell on the parking lot, where there was suddenly a swell of traffic, a big black pickup truck, shiny as if it had just come from a showroom, pulling into the lot with a low growl of its engine, and Mark followed it automatically, because cars were his language, his element, and he always noticed details, chrome wheels fitted with the precision of a jeweler, or the slight creak of the suspension that betrayed an owner who didn't care much about regular maintenance. The pickup pulled up nearby, and the passenger door opened, revealing a woman whose figure seemed painfully familiar to him, even in the twilight, even in the dim light of the streetlights that cast long shadows like claws reaching toward the asphalt. It was Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, was now loose, brushing her shoulders, and she was laughing, leaning toward someone who had stepped out of the driver's door, and that laugh, light and ringing like the clinking of glasses at a party, cut Mark to the heart because he hadn't heard it in years, not since they were young, when she would laugh at his jokes in the bar by the harbor where he repaired boats, and she would bring him coffee in a styrofoam cup, and they would talk for hours without noticing the time. But that laugh wasn't his now, it was someone else's. A man, tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a dark shirt unbuttoned to the top button, with that relaxed confidence that showed a man who knew people liked him. Mark froze, his blood pounding in his temples, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, because he recognized this man, even though he'd never seen him in person, only heard the name Rachel had mentioned with the casual ease with which one might refer to a colleague, someone unimportant. Jerry Garner, the social worker, the one whose name clung to Mark's mind like a splinter he couldn't pull out. Rachel walked next to Jerry, her hand lightly brushing his elbow, not in an overt way, but enough that Mark felt something inside him break, like someone had pulled a bolt out of a mechanism that was already barely hanging on. They were heading toward a small convenience store at the edge of the parking lot, its neon sign flashing with a promise of coffee and sandwiches, and Rachel was talking, leaning closer to Jerry, who was smiling, smoothing his hair, and the smile was so smug, so sure, that Mark felt the rage he'd always kept under control begin to leak out like oil from a cracked engine sump. He didn't realize what he was doing as he ducked down in the cab, hiding behind the wheel so they wouldn't see him, and the movement, this humiliating peeping at his wife, made him feel like a stranger, like he wasn't Mark Higgins, the technician who could take apart an engine with his eyes closed, but some pathetic spy in a pulp detective story, peeping into someone else's life. But they weren't strangers. This was his wife, his life. And this man, this Jerry, with his polished good looks and charisma, was intruding on her like a nail in a tire, destroying everything Mark had spent years building. He watched them walk into the store, Rachel still laughing, Jerry holding the door, ushering her through with a gallantry that seemed as fake to Mark as a cheap knockoff of a vintage instrument. Through the glass windows of the store, he could see them standing at the counter, ordering coffee, Rachel tilting her head as Jerry spoke, and there was something intimate about the gesture, something she hadn't done with Mark in a long time, and he felt his throat tighten, like someone had tightened a zip tie around his neck. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that it was just his coworkers, that Rachel was just tired of his silence, of his long shifts, of the way he smelled of oil and metal when he came home. But those thoughts were like a band-aid on an open wound. They didn't help. They just irritated him more. Mark clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms, and tried to remember the last time Rachel had looked at him the way she looked at Jerry, with that sparkle in her eyes, that slight tilt of her head, but the memories slipped away like sand through his fingers, and he was left with an emptiness that was worse than any pain. They walked out of the store, each holding a paper cup of coffee, and Jerry said something, pointing at the truck, and Rachel nodded, smiling, and they headed back to the car, their steps light, like they weren't carrying the weight of other people's lives. Mark hunched down even lower, his heart pounding so loudly they thought they could hear it through the glass, and he watched them get into the truck and Jerry start the engine and the truck pull out of the lot, leaving only the smell of exhaust and the emptiness that filled Mark's cab. He sat still until the headlights of their truck disappeared around the bend, and only then did he exhale, feeling the air wheeze out of his lungs as if he'd been holding it his whole life. His hands were shaking, and he clenched them into fists, trying to stop the shaking, but it wouldn't go away because it wasn't just shaking, it was rage mixed with pain, and it was growing like a storm, ready to destroy everything in its path. Mark tried to remember when it had all gone wrong, when Rachel had started to pull away, when her smiles had become less frequent and their conversations shorter. But there was too much noise in his head, too many questions and no answers. He thought about Trevor, about the way his son looked at him and Rachel, as if he knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to express it, and Mark felt guilty because he was supposed to be the father who fixed everything. But instead he was sitting here in the dark, watching his wife like a stranger. He remembered Trevor once asking why he and Rachel didn't laugh together anymore, and Mark had waved it off, saying that adults just got tired, but now he knew that was a lie, that tiredness was only part of it, and the real reason was deeper, in the cracks he hadn't noticed until they became chasms. He started the engine, feeling the truck come to life under his hands, and it was the only thing he had control over at that moment, a car that responded to him when his life was slipping away like water from a leaky bucket. Mark pulled out of the parking lot, heading home, but the road felt different now, like he was driving to someone else's home instead of his own, where there were more questions waiting for him instead of answers. He thought about Jerry, about his smile, about the way he'd held the door for Rachel, and every time that image popped into his head, he felt the rage rise, like someone was pouring gasoline on a fire that was already burning inside him. He tried to tell himself that it didn't matter, that Rachel was just tired, that she was just friends with this Jerry guy, but those thoughts were as fragile as glass, shattering against the reality of what he'd just seen. When he pulled up to the house, The light in the living room was on, and he saw Trevor's silhouette sitting on the couch, his head glued to his phone, and that was the only thing that kept him from turning around and following that black truck and finding Jerry and asking him what he was doing with his wife. But instead, he turned off the engine, sat there in silence, and tried to collect himself, because he was Mark Higgins, a man who fixed things, a man who didn't give up. But in that moment, he felt as broken as that radio he'd once found, only now he didn't know if he had the tools to fix himself. He got out of the car, closed the door, and started toward the house. But each step was heavy, as if he was carrying not just fatigue, but the weight of what he had seen in the parking lot. The door creaked open, and Trevor looked up when he saw him, but he didn't say anything, just nodded, and Mark nodded back, feeling the words catch in his throat because he didn't know how to explain to his son that the world he thought was his was beginning to crumble. Rachel wasn't back yet, and Mark knew she was probably still with Jerry, drinking coffee, laughing, and the thought was like a knife he couldn't pull out of his chest. He went into the kitchen and poured himself some water, but he didn't drink it, just stared at the glass as if it might hold the answers, and felt the madness building inside him, slow but inexorable, like rust eating away at metal. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this. This evening had changed everything, and now he couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. Mark Higgins drove his truck through the dark streets, keeping his distance so that the headlights of Jerry Garner's black truck would not be visible, but would not come close enough to be seen, and every turn, every stoplight, every screech of tires would be like a hammer blow in his chest, because he knew he was doing something he had never done before, tracking his wife like a hunter tracking prey, and the feeling was both humiliating and intoxicating, like he was teetering on the edge of a precipice and not knowing whether he would fall or stay on his feet. Night had fallen over the city, the streetlights casting long shadows that slid across the asphalt like ghosts, and Mark felt his mind slipping into the darkness, into a noir nightmare where every sound, from the honk of a passing car to the rustle of leaves caught in the wind, seemed like part of a conspiracy, part of a truth he didn't want to know but had to. His hands, still stained with grease from the wheel repair, gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he noticed how his fingers were shaking, not from the cold, but from the inner fire that was flaring up inside him, mixing rage, fear, and pain into one toxic cocktail that he couldn't spit out no matter how hard he tried. Jerry's black pickup moved confidently, as if the driver knew the road better than he should have, and Mark could feel the thought digging into his brain like a rusty nail into wood, because he didn't want to think about how Jerry navigated this neighborhood so easily, this town that was Mark's home, his fortress, his sanctuary, where he had raised Trevor, where he had built his life with Rachel, step by step, like fixing an engine, methodically, patiently, with the certainty that it would all work. But now that certainty was cracking at the seams, and every time he saw Rachel in the passenger seat turn her head toward Jerry, as if listening to what he was saying, as if they were sharing something that was just theirs, Mark felt his heart tighten, as if someone were tightening bolts in his chest, and he didn't know how much more he could take before the mechanism inside him finally snapped. The road took them through residential areas, past identical houses with neat lawns and dim windows where families ate dinner, watched television, lived their normal lives, and Mark envied them because his life was something else now, a drama, a thriller where he was both the protagonist and the victim, and he didn't know how to get out of that role. He kept to the shadows, turning off his headlights when the road allowed, so as not to attract attention, and this made him even more of a stranger in his own world, as if he were a ghost watching over his past life. The black pickup slowed, turning onto a familiar street, and Mark felt his breath catch in his throat, because this was his street, his neighborhood, where every house, every streetlight, every crack in the asphalt was as familiar to him as the lines on his own palms. He didn't want to believe that was where they were going, but the pickup pulled up right in front of his house, a two-story building with peeling paint on the shutters and a porch where he'd once sat with Rachel, sipping beer and talking about a future that now seemed as far away as the stars in the night sky. Mark parked on the next street, turning off the engine, and sat in silence, listening to his own heartbeat in his ears like a drum, keeping time with this madness he couldn't stop. He watched as Rachel got out of the truck, her hair gold in the streetlight, laughing, leaning toward Jerry, who followed, closing the door with that casual confidence that infuriated Mark because it was the opposite of his own quiet, workmanlike strength, the strength that broke bolts but not people. Rachel pulled a key from her bag, his key, the key to his house, to their house, and Mark felt the world closing in around him, as if the walls of his life were crumbling, leaving him empty. She handed the key to Jerry, and he smiled, accepting it as if it were something ordinary, as if he had a right to hold this key, to open this door, to enter this house where Trevor slept, where Mark fixed faucets and painted walls, where he built his life. They walked inside, and the living room light came on, casting a warm yellow glow across the lawn, and Mark sat in his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly he felt like he could snap it in half. This wasn't a motel, not a random parking lot, not a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. This was his home, his bed, his pillows, saturated with the smell of his and Rachel's life. And now this man, this Jerry, with his smug smile and charisma, was invading like a thief who didn't just steal things, he stole your soul. Mark tried to breathe, but the air was thick as oil, and he could feel the rage he'd always kept under control starting to bubble up like steam from an overheated boiler. He wanted to get out of the car, rush into the house, grab Jerry by the collar, and ask him who he was to be standing in his living room, drinking his coffee, touching his wife, but something held him back, fear, not of a fight, but of the truth that might gush out like blood from an open wound. He remembered Rachel making breakfast that morning, setting the plate of eggs in front of him, but not meeting his eyes, as if she were afraid he would see something there he shouldn't. And now he knew what it was, the guilt hidden behind her smile, the same smile that had once made his heart beat faster, but now cut like a knife. He thought of Trevor, of how his son was probably asleep upstairs, unaware that his mother had brought a stranger into the house, and the thought was unbearable, because Mark had always wanted to protect Trevor, to give him a home where he could feel safe, but now that home had been desecrated, like a temple entered with dirty boots. Mark looked at the windows, trying to catch movement, but all he saw were shadows sliding across the curtains, each one like a knife stabbing into his heart. He got out of the truck, closing the door quietly so as not to attract attention, and walked toward the house, keeping to the shadows of the trees that lined the street. His steps were careful but heavy, as if he was carrying not just his own body on his shoulders, but the entire weight of the betrayal he had just witnessed. He stopped at the fence, hiding behind an old oak tree whose branches overhung the lawn, and looked at the house that now seemed alien to him, as if someone had replaced it with a set and he hadn't noticed. The light in the living room went out, and Mark felt his breath catch in his throat, because he knew what that meant. They were going upstairs to the bedroom, his bedroom where he slept next to Rachel, where they whispered at night, making plans that now seemed as distant as the stars he saw overhead, cold and uncaring. He stood there in the darkness, feeling the rage mingle with despair, and tried to understand how he had gotten to this point where he, Mark Higgins, the technician who fixed everything that was broken, stood under a tree like a thief, peeping into his own life. He remembered how once, years ago, he had found an old engine in the garage that everyone had said was hopeless, and he had spent weeks taking it apart, cleaning every part until it worked, and Rachel had said he could fix anything. But now he wasn't sure he could fix this, his family, his wife, himself. He thought of Jerry, the way he held the key as if it belonged to him, and that thought was like a spark that could set fire to whatever was left of his self-control. Mark took a step toward the house, but stopped when he heard a rustling sound behind him, a cat running across the street, and he let out a breath, realizing how tense he was, as if he expected someone to be watching him, the way he was watching Rachel. He looked up at the second-story windows where the lights were on now, and imagined them in his bedroom, and the image was so clear, so painful, that he felt his knees buckle, as if someone had punched him in the gut. He wanted to rush in, to shatter the illusion, but something inside him, maybe fear, maybe the remnants of his love for Rachel, held him back, and he just stood there, looking at the house that was no longer his. He walked back to the truck and got behind the wheel and sat in silence, feeling the time dragging on, like every second was another nail in the coffin of his marriage. He thought about Trevor, about how his son would look at him if he knew the truth, and that thought was the worst of all, because Mark had always wanted to be a role model for Trevor, a man who wouldn't break down, but now he felt broken, like a car that couldn't be fixed. He started the engine, but didn't drive, just sat there, listening to the engine purr, as if trying to remind him that he could still move forward, even if his world was falling apart. In that moment, he knew this was the end, not the end of his life, not the end of his fight, but the end of what he believed in, what he thought was his. Rachel, laughing, handing over the key to Jerry, was not the woman he loved, but a stranger who lived in his house, slept in his bed, but belonged to someone else. And Mark knew he couldn't just walk away, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it, because that truth, that pain, that rage were part of him now, like oil in his veins, like metal in his bones. He sat in the truck, looking at the house, and felt something dark growing inside him, something he couldn't control, and it scared him, but at the same time gave him a strange sense of freedom, as if he had finally allowed himself to be what he was afraid to become, a man willing to burn everything to find the truth. Mark Higgins sat in his truck, parked on the street next door, where the old oak trees shaded him from the streetlights, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest like a hammer hitting an anvil, each blow echoing in his temples, in his throat, in the tips of his fingers that still gripped the steering wheel, like it was the last thing keeping him from falling into the abyss that had opened up before him when he'd seen Rachel hand the key to Jerry. Like that key, that little piece of metal, was not just the passport to his home, but a symbol of everything he'd lost. The night was thick as ink, and the air, saturated with the smell of coming rain, felt heavy, like it was pressing down on his shoulders, making Mark feel smaller than he was, like he was no longer the man who could take apart an engine with his eyes closed, fix any mechanism, bring life back to broken things. Now he was just a shadow moving in the darkness, a man watching his own life like a spectator in a movie theater, showing a film he didn't want to see but couldn't look away. He turned off the engine, and the silence crashed over him like a wave, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves blown across the pavement by the wind. Mark looked at his house, a two-story building with peeling paint, with a porch where he had once had coffee with Rachel in the mornings when Trevor was a little boy and had run across the lawn tossing a ball, and those memories were like old photographs, faded but still painfully clear. The light in the upstairs bedroom was on, and Mark knew that something was happening there, behind those curtains, that would tear his life apart. But he couldn't just sit there and wait, like a mechanic looking at a broken engine, but not picking up his tools. He had to see. He had to know. Not because he wanted the pain, but because not seeing would be worse, like living with a nail in your tire, knowing it was there, but not checking to see how deep it went. Mark opened the door of the truck, quietly enough not to make the hinges creak, and slipped out, feeling the cool air burn his skin as if his nerves were exposed wires. He moved toward the house, keeping to the shadows, darting from tree to tree like a thief, even though this was his home, his territory, and the thought of it was a punch to the gut, sneaking like a stranger in a place he had built with his own hands. His boots barely touched the ground to keep from crunching the gravel, and he could feel each step reverberating in his chest, as if he were walking not on a lawn, but on a minefield where one wrong step could blow everything up. He walked around the side of the house, heading toward the backyard, where the kitchen window was, a large one with the thin curtains Rachel had chosen years ago, because, she said, they added coziness, and now the thought seemed mocking to him, because coziness was the last thing he felt as he stood here in the dark, preparing to peer into his own life. He pressed himself against the side of the house, feeling the cold brick through his shirt, and slowly, carefully, approached the window, careful not to disturb the old rose bush that Rachel had planted when they first moved in, and which was now as spiky and wild as their marriage. Mark held his breath, leaning toward the glass, his eyes, accustomed to the darkness, beginning to make out details inside. The kitchen was lit by the dim light of the lamp over the sink that they always left on at night, and he could see the table where he and Trevor had eaten breakfast, where Rachel had sorted out the bills, where they had once laughed at silly jokes. But now the table was empty, just two empty coffee cups sitting on it like evidence at a crime scene, And Mark felt his throat tighten because those were the same cups he'd seen in Rachel and Jerry's hands in the parking lot, and now they were here in his house, proof of their break-in. He looked further into the house, where the hallway led to the stairs to the second floor. The bedroom door was closed, but a thin strip of light shone through it, and Mark knew that his world was crumbling there. He couldn't see them, he couldn't see the act of betrayal, but he didn't need to. There was a shirt on the hallway floor, carelessly discarded, dark like the one Jerry was wearing, and next to it a woman's blouse, crumpled as if it had been torn off in a hurry. Mark felt his heart skip a beat, then speed up, like an engine about to stall. He pressed closer to the glass, his breath leaving a light mist on the cold window, and noticed the shadows moving behind the curtains in the living room, blurry but clear enough to know that it was an embrace, the silhouette of two people standing too close, too intimate, and even though he couldn't see their faces, he knew they were Rachel and Jerry, knew it the same way he knew the sound of a broken engine without even looking under the hood. Everything inside him was screaming. Screaming with pain, with rage, with the humiliation he felt standing there like a stranger, peeping at his wife who had brought another man into their home, into their bedroom where they had shared their nights, where he had whispered his dreams to her, where she had promised to be with him forever. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling that was tearing him apart from the inside, like someone was yanking the wires out of his soul, one by one, leaving only the bare ends, sparking and smoking. He wanted to smash the window, to rush in, to grab Jerry by the throat and throw him out. He wanted to scream at Rachel, to ask how she could, why she had chosen this smug bastard, but he didn't move. His legs were like lead, his arms were shaking, not from weakness, but from suppressed strength, the same strength that allowed him to break rusty bolts, lift heavy parts, fix what others considered hopeless. But this was not iron, not a machine, this was his life, and he did not know how to fix it. Mark stepped back from the window, feeling the thorns of the roses cling to his jeans, the only thing that reminded him that he was still here in the real world and not in a nightmare he wished he could wake up from. He retreated back into the shadows, to the tree where he couldn't be seen, and leaned against the trunk, closing his eyes, trying to collect himself, but the images, the shirt on the floor, the closed door, the shadows in his arms flashed through his mind like scenes from a movie he couldn't turn off. He thought of Trevor, asleep upstairs, how his son probably didn't know anything but knew that something was wrong, because teenagers always knew, even if they couldn't name it. Mark remembered the way Trevor had looked at him that morning, with that mixture of worry and alienation that comes when a child begins to realize that parents aren't heroes, just people who can break. And Mark didn't want to be that person, didn't want Trevor to see him as weak. But now that's exactly how he felt, weak, broken, like a machine that no one could fix. He didn't scream. He didn't call Rachel or break into the house or pound on the door, demanding an explanation. Instead, he walked away, slowly, step by step, back to his truck, each step like a nail being driven into his heart. But he walked because he knew that screaming and rage wouldn't solve anything, that they would only give Rachel and Jerry something to justify, to lie about, to blame. No, he wouldn't scream. He would plan. His mind, accustomed to taking things apart, trying to figure out why they were broken, was already starting up like an engine that had just been started, slowly but inexorably. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he wasn't going to let it end. This was his home, his life, and he wasn't going to give it up without a fight. Mark got into the truck and started the engine, the familiar purr of the engine, the only thing that felt real to him at that moment. He pulled out of the nearby street, keeping his headlights off so as not to attract attention, and drove away from the house that was no longer his sanctuary. He thought of Jerry, his smug smile, the way he held the key as if he had a right to do so, and that thought was like a spark that could ignite whatever was left of his reserve. He thought of Rachel, the way she laughed, the way she looked at Jerry, and every time that image popped into his mind, he felt his fingers curl into fists, but he refused to let the rage take over. Not now. Rage was like fuel. It had to be used wisely, channeled, like oil in an engine to keep it running and not burning out. Mark drove through the night city, not knowing where he was going, but feeling he had to keep moving, because stopping would mean giving up, and he wasn't giving up. He remembered how once, when he was young, he'd been fixing an old boat at the docks, and everyone had said it wasn't worth the effort, but he'd spent weeks replacing rotten planks, patching the hull, until it floated again, and Rachel had looked at him with admiration, as if he were a man who could do anything. Now he wasn't sure he could fix it his family, his marriage, himself, but he knew he had to try, even if it meant taking it apart to find where it was broken. He pulled into the deserted parking lot of an old warehouse where he'd once worked and killed the engine, sitting in a silence that was louder than any scream. He thought about what he'd seen: the shirt on the floor, the closed door, the shadows in his arms, and he felt something new growing inside him. Not just rage, but a cold, calculating determination, like a technician looking at a broken machine and already knowing what tools he'll need. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this was just the beginning, that this night, this kitchen window, these hints of betrayal were the first turn of a key in a lock that would open the door to something much darker. Mark pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket that he hadn't touched in years and lit up, feeling the bitter smoke fill his lungs as if it could numb the pain. He watched the cigarette flicker in the darkness and thought about how easily fire could destroy everything: home, family, life. But he wasn't ready to burn. Not yet. He was planning, and this plan, still unformed but already maturing in his mind, was like a blueprint he would begin to draw once he found the right tools. The night was like black velvet around Mark Higgins's truck, muffling the sounds of the city but not his thoughts, which were like sparks over a campfire, ready to set fire to what was left of his mind. He was driving away from the house where he had just seen the shadows of Rachel and Jerry, their arms around each other, their clothes on the floor, the closed bedroom door, and every turn of the wheel was an attempt to move himself away from this image. But it was ingrained in his mind like oil in leather, like rust in metal. The road stretched on forever. The streetlights flickered like frames from an old film, and Mark felt like his life was turning into one of those movies they show in abandoned theaters with chewed-up film, where the image jerks, distorts, breaks, and you can't tell what is true and what is a defect. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stop. Movement was the only thing that kept him from turning around, storming into the house and smashing everything he saw into splinters, as if that could give him back control over what he had lost. Memories flashed through his mind, bright as lightning in a thunderstorm, and just as painful. He saw Rachel on the day they were married, standing there in a white dress, simple but in a way that made her look like an angel, her hair shining in the sun, laughing when he stepped awkwardly on her hem during their first dance. They were dancing to an old song, something about love forever, and Mark, young then, his hands not yet scarred from working in the garage, held her as if she were the only thing that mattered in the world. He remembered the way she looked at him, with that sparkle in her eyes that now belonged to Jerry, and the thought was like a knife he couldn't pull out of his chest. The memory gave way to another Trevor's birth, the hospital, Rachel, tired but happy, holding the baby, and Mark standing next to him, feeling his heart expand as if it could hold the whole world. They were a family, real and unbreakable, or so he thought, but now the memories seemed distorted, like frames where the film had broken, and where the happy faces had been, there were only cracks and stains. Mark pulled into the deserted parking lot of an old factory where he had once repaired trucks and turned off the engine. But the silence brought no relief, it only made the noise in his head worse, where memories mingled with what he had seen that day. He pulled a cigarette from a pack he hadn't touched in years and lit it, watching the smoke rise to the ceiling of the cab like the ghost of a past he could not return to. He remembered Rachel once telling him he smelled like a garage, but she liked it because it was the smell of his work, his strength. But now he wondered when the smell had become repulsive to her, when she had started looking for someone else who smelled of cologne and smugness like Jerry. He remembered their evenings, sitting on the porch, looking at the stars, and she'd rest her head on his shoulder, and he'd tell her about the cars he fixed, how each one was like a puzzle that had to be put together just right, and she'd listen or pretend to listen. And now he realized that maybe she'd been thinking about something else, someone else, even then. The thought was like a spark that ignited a new obsession in him. Mark couldn't just walk away, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen anything, that his life wasn't falling apart. He had to know everything. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, the screen illuminating his face, and he opened the calendar where Rachel sometimes scheduled her work appointments. He'd never checked her schedule before, thinking it unnecessary because he trusted her, but now that trust was shattered like glass, and he was searching for the pieces that might explain how he'd gotten to this point. There were entries on the calendar: meeting with client, meeting with JG, working late, and each one now seemed like a lie, a cover for a truth he didn't want to see but now couldn't ignore. JG, it was Jerry, he was sure of it, and those initials, so innocent at first glance, were like a code he had to crack to understand how deeply he had been betrayed. Mark got out of the truck, feeling the cold air bite into his skin, and began pacing the parking lot, his footsteps echoing in the empty space like hammer blows on metal. He thought about taking Rachel's phone, about checking her texts, her calls, her emails, because he knew that there he would find answers that would tear his heart out, but he couldn't stop. This obsession was like an engine he couldn't turn off. He had to take it apart, see every single part, even if it meant destroying it. He remembered finding an old radio in the garage, once that everyone thought was trash, and spending nights taking it apart, soldering wires until it played again, and Rachel had told him that he would never give up. But now he wasn't sure if he was giving up or just drowning in this madness of his own making. Returning home late that night, with the bedroom light out, Mark entered quietly, like a thief, even though it was his house. He knew Rachel was probably asleep or pretending to be asleep, and Jerry might have already left, or worse, stayed behind, but Mark didn't go upstairs. Instead, he went to the living room where Rachel had left her phone charging, as she did every night. His hands shook when he picked it up, and the screen lit up, demanding a password, and Mark entered their wedding date, the code she'd been using for years, and the phone opened like a chest of secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to know. He opened the messages, scrolling through them, and every word, every emoji, every line from Jerry was like a wrench hitting his chest. "See you tomorrow. You were great today. I can't wait." Phrases that might have been innocent in another context, but now felt like evidence, confirming what he already knew. He found their text messages long, too long for mere colleagues, and each message was another nail in the coffin of his marriage. There were photos: Rachel laughing in the office, Jerry standing too close, and even one selfie of them together, their faces beaming, as if they belonged to each other and not to him. Mark put the phone back down, feeling his breathing become ragged, like he'd been running a marathon but couldn't stop. He walked into the kitchen, where those two coffee cups were still sitting, and stared at them as if they could tell him more than he already knew. He remembered Rachel making him coffee in the morning, how she knew how much sugar he liked, how she teased him about his habit of drinking it too hot, and now those memories were like shards of glass he couldn't pick up because they cut into his hands. He thought about Trevor, about his son sleeping upstairs, unaware that his mother was destroying their family, and that thought was the worst of all because Mark had always wanted to be Trevor's rock, the person who fixed things instead of breaking them, but now he felt broken, like a machine that no one could fix. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty glasses, and his mind began to work like an engine he had just started, slowly but inexorably. He didn't scream, didn't smash anything, though his hands shook with the urge to squeeze, to break, to destroy. Instead, he began to plan, like a technician looking at a broken machine and figuring out what tools he would need. He didn't know what he would do, but he knew he wouldn't let this continue. He would check her schedule. He would keep an eye on her. He would find out how far this betrayal had gone, because this wasn't just pain, now it was war, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. The obsession was growing inside him like rust eating away at metal, and he could feel it taking hold of him, but he did not resist. He wanted to know everything, every encounter, every text, every look Rachel had given Jerry, because only then could he figure out how to fix it, or, if it could not be fixed, how to destroy it so that no one would get away with it. He thought of Jerry, his smug smile, the way he held the key to his house, and the thought was fuel for the fire that burned in his chest. He thought of Rachel, the way she had lied to him, the way she had looked at him in the morning, pretending that everything was all right, and that lie was the worst of all because it had turned him into a fool, into a man who believed in a love that had died long ago. Mark stood up, put Rachel's phone away, and walked out of the house without turning on the lights, without leaving a trace. He got into the truck, started the engine, and drove into the night, feeling like his mind was turning into a maze, where every turn led to new questions, new plans, new ways to take back control. He knew this was crazy, knew this obsession could destroy him, but he couldn't stop. This was his marriage, his family, his life, and he wasn't going to give it up without a fight. The memories of their wedding, their first dance, Trevor's birth were like stills from an old movie he'd loved, but now they were warped, broken, and he didn't know if he'd ever be able to look at them without pain. It was a gray day, with low clouds that hung over the city like the lid of a boiler about to explode, and Mark Higgins walked down the sidewalk, his boots thumping against the asphalt with a measured precision, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. He was no longer the man who hid in the shadows, peering at his life through the kitchen window, or the man who shook with rage and pain as he scrolled through the messages on Rachel's phone. There was a cold, calculating determination in him now, like an engineer looking at a blueprint and knowing which bolts to tighten and which to rip out. His mind, accustomed to taking things apart, finding the source of the problem and fixing it, was now working on a different project, a project he had mentally named Fire, because fire was the only thing that could cleanse his life of the rust of betrayal, the filth that Rachel and Jerry had brought into his home. He didn't know when the idea had formed in his mind, maybe when he'd seen their shadows in their arms, maybe when he'd found those messages, but now it was as clear as a diagram of an engine, and he was moving toward it with the methodical precision of someone fixing a car that needed to run again, even if it meant burning the old one. Mark walked into a hardware store on the edge of town, where the smell of wood and paint and metal mingled in the air, reminding him of his workshop, where he had always felt in his element, where every problem had a solution, every screw in its place. He put on gloves, the thin leather ones he usually used for working with wires, so as not to leave marks, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted everything to look clean, like an accident, as if fate had decided to intervene. The salesman, an older man with gray hair at his temples and paint stains on his apron, greeted him, and Mark smiled, briefly but friendly enough not to arouse suspicion. "Looking for something for the garage," he said, and his voice was calm, almost cheerful, as if he were buying a hammer to fix a fence rather than something that would change his life forever. The salesman nodded, pointing to the tool aisle, and Mark moved toward it, his eyes scanning the shelves, but he knew what he needed, knew it as precisely as he knew what wrench to use for a certain size bolt. He picked up a gas can, a metal one that held 10 gallons of gas with a sturdy handle, the kind they used to keep gasoline in garages, and checked to make sure the cap screwed on tightly, without leaks. "For an old generator," he explained to the salesman when he asked why it was so big, and he added a joke about how his old pickup guzzled gas like a teenager guzzles pizza, and the salesman laughed, slapping his knee, unaware that the man in front of him was not just a technician with a sense of humor, but a man whose mind had become a blueprint for a destructive plan. Mark added some wire, some electrical tape, and a couple of fuses to the purchase, nothing out of the ordinary for a man who worked with electricity, but in his mind these things weren't just tools, they were parts of a machine he was assembling, like an engineer who knew how to create a short circuit that no one would suspect until it was too late. He paid in cash, not using a card so as not to leave a digital trace, and walked out of the store, carrying the gas can in one hand and the bag of wires in the other, his steps as measured as before, but now with a purpose, as if he were walking on tracks he had laid out for himself. Outside, he paused, breathing in the cold air that smelled of asphalt and approaching rain, and looked up at the sky, where the clouds were gathering like his thoughts, dark and heavy, ready to burst into a storm. He thought of Rachel, the way she had smiled at Jerry, the way she had given him the key to their house, and the image was like a spark that kept the fire in his chest burning. But now the fire was not chaotic, but focused, like a blowtorch cutting through metal with surgical precision. Memories of fixing cars in the shop kept coming back to him, of finding fault with the wiring, of sparks flying when he connected the wires incorrectly, and he knew how to make those sparks look like an accident. He was an engineer, a man who took machines apart and put them back together, and now he was building something new, not a car, not an engine, but a plan that would give him back control, even if it meant burning everything down. He remembered the time an old truck in the shop had caught fire because of faulty wiring, and the fire department had called it an accident. No one had suspected arson because fire leaves no trace if you know how to direct it. Mark knew. He knew how to overload a circuit, how to leave an exposed wire, how to make it look like the electricity had decided to run amok. He pulled into a gas station, one of those all-nighters with neon signs and tired cashiers who barely looked at the customers. Mark filled the gas can, feeling the heavy liquid sloshing around inside, and the smell of the fuel, sharp and acrid, was a reminder of what he was doing. He pulled his gloves back on to avoid leaving fingerprints and paid in cash, commenting briefly on how his lawn mower had stalled again, and the cashier nodded, not paying attention because no one cared about other people's problems at 2 in the morning. Mark walked back to the truck and put the can in the back. Next to the tools, he always carried with him wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, and felt a strange satisfaction, as if these things, these simple objects, were his allies in what he was about to do. Back home, he parked the truck in the garage, where the smell of oil and metal was his sanctuary, his temple, where he could always find order in chaos. He carried the gas can inside, hiding it behind the toolbox, and began to disassemble the wires he'd bought, testing them as if they were engine parts he was reassembling. His movements were precise, controlled, like a surgeon who knows where to make an incision. He thought of Trevor, of his son sleeping in his room, unaware that his father was turning into someone else, a man willing to go to extremes to protect what was left of their family. Mark didn't want Trevor to get hurt, didn't want him to know the truth, but he knew that the truth had already seeped into their home like smoke, and there was no escaping it. He sat down on the old chair in the garage, looking at his hands, still in their gloves, and thought of Rachel, asleep upstairs, or maybe not asleep, but thinking of Jerry, his smile, his touch, and the thought was like acid, eating away at him from the inside. He remembered how he and Rachel had once worked on an old motorcycle in this same garage, how she had handed him the tools, laughing when he swore at the rusted bolts, and how she had told him he could fix anything if he wanted to. Now he wasn't sure he could fix their marriage, but he knew he could destroy what had destroyed it. He thought of Jerry, his black truck, the way it had walked into his house like it was his right, and the thought was like fuel he poured into his plan, into his fire. Mark stood up, put the wires away in the box, and locked the garage, but he didn't go into the house. He got into the truck, started the engine, and just sat there, listening to the engine purr, as if to remind him that he was still alive, still capable of action. He didn't know when exactly he would put his plan into action, but he knew it would be soon. He was an engineer, a man who fixed things, but now he was going to destroy, and the destruction would be as precise as his work with machines. He imagined the fire raging, eating everything Rachel and Jerry had left in his life, and the image was strangely comforting, like a blueprint finally coming together in his mind. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck, feeling the cold air burn his lungs, and looked at his house, where his son and his wife, the woman who had become a stranger, slept. He knew this was just the beginning, that his plan, his fire, wasn't ready yet, but he was on his way, and every step, every wire, every drop of gasoline was bringing him closer to taking back control, even if it meant burning everything to the ground. Friday began with a deceptive stillness, as if the world had decided to hold its breath before bearing down on Mark Higgins with all its weight. The sky was gray, with heavy clouds that hung so low you could almost brush them, and the air smelled of rain mixed with something acrid, like a sense of foreboding. Mark sat in his pickup, parked in an alley 2 blocks from his house, his fingers tapping the steering wheel in a rhythm he didn't understand, as if his body were trying to maintain its balance, while his mind teetered on the edge of a precipice. He waited for the moment he'd planned with the cold, engineer's precision that allowed him to fix cars, take them apart, and put them back together again. But now it was a skill that was geared not toward repair, but toward destruction. His plan, his fire, was ready, like a blueprint, verified to the millimeter, and today, this Friday, it was to be realized. Rachel had said that morning that she was going to see a friend, an old school friend she hadn't seen in months, and her voice was as light as it always was when she lied, with that subtle edge to it that Mark had learned to detect like a technician detecting a strange noise in an engine. He nodded, not looking her in the eye, because he knew what he would see there, the emptiness behind the smile, the same emptiness he had seen when she handed the key to Jerry, when she had laughed with him in the store, when their shadows had met in an embrace behind the curtains of his house. He hadn't asked where she was going or her name, because it didn't matter. He knew she was going to see Jerry. He knew it as surely as he knew that a wire with damaged insulation would spark when current was applied. He sent Trevor to the movies, checked the schedule, made sure his son would be busy until late in the evening, because Trevor was the only thing he wanted to protect, the only thing he still held on to, the remnants of his old self. Mark got out of the truck, closing the door quietly so as not to attract attention, and moved toward the house, keeping to the shadows of the trees that lined the street, their branches hanging over the sidewalk like arms, shielding him from view. In his backpack were a can of gas, some wire, some duct tape, and a couple of tools, nothing unusual for a man working in a garage. But in his hands, these things weren't just tools. They were weapons he intended to use with the same precision he used to fix engines. He wore gloves, thin leather ones so as not to leave marks, and his movements were calm, measured, as if he were doing a routine job and not preparing for something that would change his life. He stopped behind the old oak tree that grew near the fence of his house and looked out the windows, where there was no light yet, but he knew that would change soon. He waited like a hunter who knows the habits of his prey, and his heart beat steadily, although the hand that gripped the handle of the canister trembled, as if his body knew what his mind refused to acknowledge. He thought of Rachel, how she made coffee in the morning, how she set the cup in front of him, but didn't look him in the eye, as if she were afraid he'd see the truth behind her smile. He remembered how she'd once made him breakfast, laughing at his habit of drinking his coffee too hot, how she'd sat next to him while he talked about the cars he fixed, and how her laughter had been like music he wanted to listen to forever. Now that laughter was Jerry's, and the thought was like a spark that kept the fire burning in his chest, a fire he'd named Fire, because only fire could cleanse his life of the pain, the betrayal, the lies that had eaten into his home like rust into metal. He knew Jerry was coming. He'd seen their correspondence. He knew their schedule. He knew Rachel had lied about her friend because her meetings with Jerry always took place on Fridays, when Trevor was at school or with friends, and Mark was supposedly late at the workshop. The bedroom light came on as he expected, and Mark felt his breath catch, as if someone had pulled a wire from his lungs. He saw shadows moving behind the curtains, blurry but clear enough to recognize Rachel, her silhouette, her movements, which he knew better than his own. Then a second shadow appeared, taller, broader in the shoulders, and Mark knew it was Jerry, knew it as surely as he knew that a nail in a tire would stop a car if you didn't pull it out in time. He stood pressed against the tree, feeling the bark scrape his back through his shirt, and watched the shadows merge as if they were part of a whole, and the sight was like a knife he couldn't pull out of his chest. His hand, clutching the canister, was shaking harder, and he felt the metal warm against his palm, as if the canister were alive, as if it knew what he was about to do. He remembered fixing the old motorcycle in the garage, Rachel handing him the tools, laughing when he swore at the rusted bolts, and telling him he could fix anything if he wanted to. Now he wasn't sure he could fix their marriage, but he knew he could destroy what had destroyed it. He thought of Jerry, of his black truck, of the way he'd walked into his house as if he had a right to do so, and the thought was the fuel he poured into his plan. He knew how to short out a wire, just expose it, overload the circuit, add a little gasoline, and start a fire faster than anyone could figure out what had happened. He'd seen it once in the shop when the old truck had caught fire from faulty wiring, and the fire department had called it an accident. No one had suspected arson, because fire leaves no trace if you know how to direct it. Mark moved toward the backyard, keeping to the shadows, his steps silent, as if he were a ghost who had come back to claim what was his. He circled the side of the house, heading toward the garage where he kept his tools, where the smell of oil and metal was his refuge, his temple, where he could always find order in chaos. He opened the garage door quietly, so as not to disturb the silence, and stepped inside, the familiar scent enveloping him, as if to remind him that he was still Mark Higgins, a man who fixed, even if he now intended to destroy. He set the can down on the floor next to the toolbox and began to work, his hands moving with the same precision he'd had when he'd fixed engines. But now they were dismantling the wiring in the house, exposing the wires that led to the outlet in the bedroom, the same bedroom where the light was on now, where Rachel and Jerry were together, unaware that he was there, that he was seeing, that he knew. He worked quickly but carefully, like an engineer who knows every detail is important. He took the cover off the electrical panel, found the wire in question, stripped it bare, leaving enough metal to spark, but not so much that it would look suspicious. He knew how houses worked, how electricity flowed through wires, how it could be an enemy if given the chance. He poured some gasoline on the garage floor, not too much to arouse suspicion, but enough to ensure a fire would spread quickly if a spark did the trick. He acted as if he were fixing a car, but instead of bringing life back, he was preparing death not for people, but for what was left of his marriage, his home, his illusions. When he was finished, he walked out of the garage, closing the door behind him, and returned to the tree where he could see the bedroom windows. The light was still on, and the shadows moved, as if dancing in their own world, a world where Mark did not exist. He stood there, feeling his hand tremble on the canister he had never let go of, and in that moment he realized that he was standing on the edge. He could walk away, he could stop, he could just throw the canister away and try to forget. But the thought was unbearable, because to forget meant accepting the betrayal, to accept that Rachel had chosen someone else, that his home was no longer his, that his life was just pieces he could not pick up. He whispered to himself, "Without smoke there will be no freedom," and the words, like a spell, strengthened his resolve, as if the smoke he was about to create could cleanse him of the pain, of the humiliation, of the love that still lived inside him despite everything. He thought of Trevor, of the way his son would look at him if he knew what his father had done, and the thought was like cold water that would put out the fire. But Mark pushed it away because Trevor was safe, at the movies, far away from this house, from this fire. He thought of Rachel, how she had laughed with Jerry, how she had lied to him, how she had made a fool of him, and the thought was like fuel he was pouring on the fire. He thought of Jerry, his smug smile, his black pickup truck parked outside his house like a mockery, and the thought was like a match waiting to flare. Mark walked back to the truck, got behind the wheel, and started the engine, but he didn't drive away. He sat there looking at the house, at the light in the bedroom, and he felt his mind turning into a machine he had created, cold, precise, implacable. He knew he had done everything right, that the wiring was ready, that the gas was there, that the spark would fire when it was time. He didn't know when exactly that would happen, an hour, a day, a week, but he knew it would be soon. He was an engineer, a man who fixed things, but now he was a man who destroyed, and his destruction would be as precise as his work with machines. He pulled out of the alley, heading for nowhere, because the house he had left behind was no longer his home. He thought about the past, about the way Rachel had looked at him when they were young, the way she had held his hand when Trevor was born, the plans they had made that were now ashes in his head. He thought about the future, about what would come after, when the fire had done its work, and the thought was strangely comforting, like a blueprint that had finally come together. He didn't know what would happen to him, to Rachel, to Trevor, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't give in. He wouldn't let betrayal win. He wouldn't let Jerry take his life. Mark drove through the city at night, the headlights of his truck cutting through the darkness like a knife, but inside him the darkness was thicker than the night outside. He could feel his fire waiting to happen, and that thought was the only thing keeping him from breaking down. He was Mark Higgins, the man who fixes, the man who destroys, and today, this Friday, he had taken the first step toward taking back control, even if it meant burning everything to the ground. Night had fallen on the city like a heavy blanket, saturated with the smell of coming rain, and Mark Higgins sat in his pickup, parked in an alley 3 blocks from the house where his life, like an old movie reel, was burning out in a fire he had started. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and only the faint light of the street lamps filtered through the foliage, casting long, jagged shadows on the asphalt that were like his thoughts, ragged, restless, but sharp as a blade. He waited, his hands on the wheel, still wearing the gloves he had worn since he had finished working in the garage, where exposed wires and a pool of gasoline awaited the spark that would turn his plan, his fire, into reality. His heart beat steadily, but each beat echoed in his temples like a hammer hitting an anvil, and he felt time dragging on, as if each second were a nail that he himself was driving into the coffin of his past life. He didn't look at his watch, but he knew the moment was near. He could see the light in the bedroom on, the shadows of Rachel and Jerry moving behind the curtains, and the sight was like rust eating away at him from the inside, but he wouldn't let himself think of them as people. They were part of a mechanism that had broken down, part of a machine he couldn't fix but could destroy. He remembered Rachel once telling him he smelled like a garage, and how she liked it because it was the smell of his work, his strength. But now the smell was mixed with the acrid scent of the gasoline he had spilled in the garage, and the thought was like fuel for the fire that burned in his chest. He didn't know exactly when it would start. The spark might come in a minute or 10, but he knew it would come because he had done everything right, like an engineer who leaves no room for error. And then he saw it, the first glimmer, a faint orange glow in the garage window that quickly grew to a flicker, as if someone had lit a candle. But this candle was hungry, greedy, ready to devour anything in its path. Fire. It had started as Mark had planned, with the precision with which he fixed engines, but now he was not fixing, he was destroying, and the destruction was his release. He watched the flames lick the garage window, crawling up to the roof, where the dry wooden beams he had once painted became food for the fire. Smoke began to rise, black and thick as his thoughts, and Mark felt a strange relief, as if the smoke were carrying away his pain, his humiliation, his betrayal. The alarm didn't go off. He knew it wouldn't. He'd disabled it earlier in the day, when he'd pretended to check the wiring, his hands moving with practiced dexterity, but instead of repairing, he was preparing chaos. He didn't see who had come out of the house, didn't want to see it, because the faces of Rachel and Jerry, their possible fear or panic, might break his resolve, might remind him that he was still a man, not a machine he'd created. He just stared at the fire that was now engulfing the entire first floor and listened to the sirens wailing somewhere in the distance. The fire department, the police, someone had already noticed, but Mark knew they would arrive too late to save the house, to save what he'd once called his life. He started the engine, and the truck roared to life with a low, guttural growl that was the only sound above the crackling flames in his head. He turned on the radio, and the music began to blare, heavy, with piercing guitars and drums that beat in rhythm with his heart, as if it were the soundtrack to this tragedy, to this moment when he was finally free. He pulled out of the alley without looking back, because to look back would be to see Rachel's face in the flames, her eyes that had once looked at him with love, and now belonged to someone else. He drove through the night city, headlights catching bits of asphalt, but his mind was somewhere out there, in the fire, in the smoke, in the house he had built that was now burning like his marriage, like his hopes. Mark told himself that he was free, that the fire had cleansed him, that the smoke had taken away his pain, but the words were like a mantra he repeated to keep from thinking about what he had left behind. He saw Rachel's face, not the one laughing with Jerry, but the one standing in the white dress at their wedding, the one holding Trevor in her arms at the hospital, the one who had once been his world. That face was in the flames, in every glimmer he saw in the rearview mirror, and it wouldn't let go, as if the fire he had lit was now burning inside him, burning away not just the house, but the last of his soul. He tried to drown it out with music, pressing down on the gas pedal, as if the speed would take him away from himself. But Rachel's face remained like an imprint on his retinas, like a burn mark that wouldn't heal. The city flashed past the windows, the lights of stores and gas stations blurring into stripes, and Mark felt like the hero of some dark movie where there was no happy ending, only tragedy unfolding with inexorable force. He thought of Trevor, of the way his son would look at him when he found out what his father had done, and the thought was like cold water that could put out the fire. But Mark pushed it away because Trevor was safe in the movies, far away from this house, from this fire. He thought of Rachel, how she might be screaming, trying to get out, or maybe she wasn't screaming, just staring at the fire, knowing that this was the end. He didn't know, and he didn't want to know, because knowing would make him a man, and he wanted to be a machine, cold, precise, implacable. He drove, the music blaring, drowning out the sirens that were growing louder, but were already far behind him. He told himself that it was necessary, that without the smoke there would be no freedom, that fire was the only way to cleanse his life of the lies, the betrayal, the pain that had eaten into him like oil into skin. But Rachel's face did not disappear in the flames, and he knew it would be there, like a scar he would carry for the rest of his days. He thought about tomorrow, when the ashes settled, when the firemen cleared the rubble, when Trevor asked why their home was gone. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he would not go back, because there was no going back, only forward, through the smoke, through the fire, through the tragedy of his own making. Mark stopped on a deserted road, somewhere outside the city, where there were no streetlights, only the stars, cold and indifferent, looking down on him. He turned off the music, and the silence crashed over him like a wave, heavy, suffocating. But in that silence he heard his own voice whispering, "I am free." But it was a lie, and he knew it, because freedom doesn't smell like smoke, doesn't burn in your chest, doesn't leave behind a wife's face that you see in every flicker of flame. He sat in the truck, staring into the darkness, and felt his fire burn out, leaving only ashes, the ashes of his marriage, his home, himself. The morning after the fire was cold and gray, as if the sky had decided to reflect the ashes that had settled on the ruins of Mark Higgins's house. The city woke slowly, with the lazy hum of cars and the distant barking of dogs. But for Mark the world had stopped, frozen at the point where the flames had consumed his life, leaving only smoke and questions he didn't want to answer. He sat in an empty house on the outskirts of town that had belonged to his late uncle, an old mechanic whose life had been as lonely as Mark's was now. The house smelled of mildew and old wood, the walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and in the corner of the room stood a single lamp, casting a dim light on the bare floor. Mark stared at the wall, his eyes reddened from lack of sleep and the smoke that still seemed to hang in the air, unmoving, as if he were trying to find in the cracks of the plaster the answer to the question that had been tormenting him since he saw the fire. Had he won or lost everything? His hands, still smelling of gasoline despite the fact that he had washed them until they bled, lay motionless in his lap, as if afraid to do anything that might disturb this fragile silence. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't check his phone, didn't listen to the radio, because he knew that there, in the news, in the messages, in the voices of the anchors, would be his house, his fire, his tragedy, and he wasn't ready to hear strangers pick apart his life as if it were just another incident on the morning news. He thought of Trevor, of his son, who had been at the movies when the fire had consumed their house, and that thought was the only thing that kept him from getting up, picking up a wrench, and smashing everything that was left in that empty house. Trevor was safe, that was the main thing, but Mark knew that safety was not the same as happiness, and he was afraid that his son would never forgive him for what he had done, even if he never knew the truth. The detective was Mora, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that sounded like she had seen too many fires, too many deaths, too many broken homes to believe in happy endings. Mark had met her that morning when he had driven to the burned-out house to collect what was left, though he knew there was nothing left, no photographs, no furniture, no memories that had not been soaked in the smoke. Mora stood among the charred beams, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, her face set in an expression that was both tired and watchful, like someone who knows the truth is hidden in the details. "Preliminary technical glitch," she said, looking at Mark, her eyes seeming to search his face for something he didn't want to show. "The wiring is old. The house is not new. It happens," she added, but her tone was too even, too professional, and Mark felt his stomach clench, as if someone had tightened a bolt in his insides. He nodded without saying a word, because words might give him away, might be the spark that would start another fire, this time in his soul. Mora went on, something about how the firemen had failed to save the house, how the fire had spread too quickly, how the alarm had failed, and every word she said was like a hammer blow to his chest. But he stood there, looking at the black bones of what had once been his home, and thought about how perfectly he had calculated everything. He knew the wiring was old. He knew the gasoline would speed up the flames. He knew the alarm wouldn't go off because he had disabled it himself. And now, listening to Mora, he felt a strange satisfaction, like an engineer looking at a machine he had built and seeing that it worked exactly as he had intended. But that satisfaction was mixed with something else, a heaviness that settled in his chest like ash, because he didn't know who had left the house. He didn't know if Rachel and Jerry were alive. And worse, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Trevor was shocked when he found out. Mark had received a text from his brother, Rob, who had picked Trevor up from the cinema as news of the fire began to spread. "I have him," Rob wrote. "He doesn't know what to do. He's crying. Where are you?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. He sat in the empty house, staring at the wall, and imagined Trevor's face, his eyes full of tears, his voice probably shaking as he asked why their house had burned down, why his life, so simple and safe, had turned to ashes. Mark wanted to go to him, to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay, but he knew that would be a lie, because nothing would be okay, not now, not after he had set his world on fire. He thought about the way Trevor had looked at him when they were little, with admiration, like he was a hero who could fix anything, a bike, a car, even a broken heart. But Mark was no hero now. He was a man who had destroyed everything he loved, and that thought was like a nail he couldn't pull out of his soul. Detective Mora continued to ask questions as Mark stood in the charred remains of the house. She asked him where he had been that night, why he had not been home when the fire had started, and he answered briefly in a monotone, as if he were reading from an instruction manual. "Working late in the shop," he said, and that was true, except that he had neglected to mention how he had returned to the house, how he had waited in the shade of the trees, how he had looked at the light in the bedroom, how his hand had trembled on the gas can. Mora watched him, her eyes like sensors searching for a malfunction, but she said nothing, only nodded and wrote something down in her notebook. "We'll be in touch," she added, and Mark knew that this was not the end, that the investigation was just beginning, that Mora, with her keen eye and professional intuition, would dig until she found something he might have overlooked. He walked back to the empty house on the outskirts of town, sat down on an old chair that creaked under his weight, and stared at the wall again. It was bare, stained with damp, and in those stains he saw Rachel's face, not the one laughing with Jerry, but the one standing in a white dress at their wedding, the one holding Trevor in her arms, the one who had been his world. That face was in the flames, in every glimmer he had seen in the rearview mirror as he drove away from the burning house, and it clung to him like a scar that hurts even as the wound heals. He wondered if he had won, if he had taken back control, if he had cleansed his life of betrayal, as he had promised himself when he whispered, "Without smoke, there is no freedom." But now, in the silence of that empty house, he was not sure. Victory doesn't smell like ashes, doesn't leave behind a void that's heavier than any weight he's ever lifted in the workshop. He thought about Trevor, about how his son would live with this, how he would look at the world, knowing that his home, his family, his safety had burned down in one night. Mark had wanted to protect him, wanted to be the father who fixed it instead of breaking it. But now he was the man who had destroyed everything he loved, and that thought was worse than any fire. He remembered Trevor once asking him why he worked so hard, and Mark had told him that he did it for him, for their family, so that they would have a future. Now that future was gone, and Mark didn't know how to explain that to his son, how he had done it not out of hate, but out of pain, out of a love that had become poison in his veins. He stood up, walked to the window that looked out onto the deserted, weed-choked yard, and looked up at the sky, where the clouds were finally beginning to part, revealing a patch of blue that mocked his life. He thought of Detective Mora, the way she had looked at him as if she knew more than she was telling, and the thought was like a cold wind that went straight to his bones. He knew the investigation would continue, that Mora would be digging, looking for clues he might have left behind, a trail of gasoline, a fingerprint, a chance word that would give him away. He was an engineer, a man who left no room for error, but now he wasn't sure if he had considered everything, if all the wires were in place, all the bolts were tight. Mark walked back to the chair and sat down and stared at the wall again, feeling the silence pressing down on him as if it were smoke he had created. He thought about Rachel, wondering if she had gotten out or if she was still there in the fire, and that uncertainty was the worst of all, because it made him feel like a man, not a machine. He wanted to be a machine, cold, precise, unforgiving, but Rachel's face, her eyes, her laughter that he saw in the flames reminded him that he was still a man, still capable of pain, guilt, and love. He wondered if he had won, if he had taken back control, or if he had lost everything: his family, his home, himself. There was no answer, only the wall, only the silence, only the ashes that settled in his soul. He thought about what would happen next, when Maura would come with more questions, when Trevor would ask why it had all happened, when the truth he had hidden so carefully would begin to seep through like smoke. He knew he couldn't run forever, that the fire he had started would haunt him like a shadow, like Rachel's face in the flames. But he wasn't sorry, not really. He had done what he had to, what he thought would give him his freedom back, but he knew now that freedom wasn't smoke or ashes or a broken home. Freedom was something he had never known, and perhaps never would. Mark sat staring at the wall, feeling his life turn into a blueprint he couldn't figure out, like a car he couldn't fix. Had he won, or lost it all? The question hung in the air like the smoke he'd left behind, and there was no answer, only emptiness, only ashes, only Rachel's face burning in his memory like a fire he could never put out. The wind blew ash across the deserted street like ghosts that could not find peace, and Mark Higgins stood at the edge of what had once been his home, his life, his sanctuary. The ashes spread out before him like an open wound, black and charred, with exposed beams that resembled the skeleton of some giant beast that had fallen in a battle it had started. The sky above was heavy, leaden, with clouds that seemed to weigh on his shoulders, as if to remind him that the weight of what he had done was still there, even if the firefighters had left and the police tape that had cordoned off the area had long since disappeared, blown away by the wind or by nosy neighbors. Mark stood still, his boots buried in mud mixed with ash, and he could feel the ash settling on his skin, in his lungs, as if it had become part of him, part of what he had destroyed. The last day began quietly, without sirens, without voices, without the noise that had accompanied his life since the night the fire had consumed everything he knew. He had not slept for days, his eyes red and dry, looking out at the world as if through a murky glass, where everything was distorted: faces, sounds, even his own thoughts. He lived in an empty house on the outskirts, his uncle's house, where the walls smelled of mildew and the silence was heavier than the smoke he had left behind. He avoided Trevor, avoided calls from Rob, avoided even mirrors, because he was afraid to see in them the man he had become, a man who had set fire to his house to burn away his pain, only to find that pain did not burn, only smoldered, eating into him like rust into metal. But today he could no longer hide. Something drew him back to the ashes, to the place where his life had turned to coals, and he went, not knowing what he was looking for, but feeling that he had to find at least something to understand who he was now: a winner or a loser, an engineer or a destroyer. The police were no longer guarding the station. Detective Maura, with her sharp eyes and her voice that cut like a scalpel, had not appeared for a week, and Mark knew that her preliminary conclusion, technical failure, still held, like a shaky bridge over an abyss. He was careful, he was precise, like an engineer who leaves no room for error, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face: not Rachel, but Maura, with her notebook, with her questions that were like wires searching for a short circuit. She had found nothing that would indicate arson, but Mark knew that she would not stop, that her intuition, like a sensor, would search for the fault until she found it. He was not afraid of her, not exactly, but he felt her shadow hanging over him, like clouds over this ashen place, reminding him that the truth, like fire, could flare up at any moment. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the charred rubble, and each step was like a trip back in time, where every corner of this house was filled with memories: Rachel laughing in the kitchen, Trevor running across the lawn, their evenings on the porch, when the world seemed as simple and reliable as the engine he'd just fixed. It was all ash now, and Mark could feel the ash settling into his soul, as if he'd become part of the ruins he'd created. He stopped at what had once been the living room, where Rachel had left her phone to charge, where he'd found the texts from Jerry that had sparked his fire. There was nothing there now, no furniture, no walls, just black ash and bits of charred wood that crunched underfoot like bones. He dropped to his knees, not because he wanted to, but because his legs wouldn't support him anymore, as if the weight of everything he'd done had finally caught up with him, crushing him to the ground like a workshop press. His hands, still smelling of gasoline despite the fact that he'd washed them raw, began to dig through the ashes, as if he were searching for something that might give him an answer, that might tell him whether he'd won or lost. His fingers found something hard, something metallic, and he pulled out a charred ring, small and blackened, with just a faint pattern that the fire hadn't completely destroyed. He held it in his hand, turning it over, trying to figure out if it was Rachel's ring, the one he'd put on her finger on their wedding day, or just a piece of metal that the fire had turned into a symbol of his loss. He didn't recognize it. The fire had erased all the details, all the memories that could tell him whose it was, and this uncertainty was worse than any truth. The wind blew harder, lifting up ash that swirled around him like a swarm of insects, and Mark felt the particles settle on his face, in his eyes, in his lungs, as if the ashes wanted to become a part of him, to remind him that he could not walk away from what he had done. He did not cry. His eyes were dry, like the ashes that surrounded him, because tears would be an admission of weakness, and he did not want to be weak, did not want to be a man who felt, because feelings were what had brought him here, to this ashes, to this ring, to this emptiness. He looked at the ring, clutching it in his fist, and his mind, accustomed to taking apart mechanisms, to looking for malfunctions, tried to find meaning in this piece of metal, in this ash, in this silence. But there was no meaning, only emptiness, only the wind, only questions he could not answer. He thought about Trevor, about his son living with Rob, how he probably looked at the world with the same pain Mark did, but without answers, without understanding why their home, their family, their life had turned to embers. Mark wanted to go to him, to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay, but he knew that would be a lie, because nothing would be okay, not after he had set his world on fire. He remembered how Trevor had looked at him when he was little with admiration, like a hero who could fix anything. But now he was no longer a hero, but a man who had destroyed everything he loved, and that thought was like a nail he couldn't pull out of his soul. He thought about Trevor asking him why, and what would he say the truth that would destroy his son, or the lie that would be worse. He thought about Rachel, and whether she had gotten out of the fire, or whether she had stayed there, in the bedroom where he had seen their shadows, where he had set his pain, his love, his betrayal on fire. He didn't know, and that unknown was like poison coursing through his veins, poisoning him. But he couldn't bring himself to know, because the truth might be worse than the ashes he held in his hands. He remembered her face, not the one that had laughed with Jerry, but the one that had looked at him on their wedding day, with that spark in her eyes that promised eternity. But that eternity had burned away, like their home, like their marriage, like his heart. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to blame her for everything. But instead he felt an emptiness that was heavier than any hatred, any pain. Mark stood up, still clutching the ring, and looked at the ashes that had been his home, his life, his past. He remembered building this house, painting the walls, mending the roof, Rachel choosing the curtains, laughing that they added coziness, and how he believed this house would be their refuge, their fortress, where they would be happy forever. Now it was just a pile of coals, and he was a man who had destroyed his refuge to save himself, but had not saved, only lost. He thought of Detective Mora, of her eyes that sought the truth, of her questions that were like wires searching for a spark, and he knew that she would come back, that she would find something, a trace of gasoline, a fingerprint, evidence, and then his fire would be not only his release, but also his end. He knelt again, feeling the ashes crunch beneath him, and looked down at the ring he still clutched. He didn't know if it was Rachel's ring, but it didn't matter at that moment, because it was a symbol of everything he had lost, not just her, but himself, his family, his life. The wind blew again, and the ashes hit him in the face, as if to remind him that he couldn't walk away from what he had done, that the ashes were all that was left of his fire, of his plan, of his freedom. He didn't cry because tears would be an admission of defeat, and he didn't want to admit that he had lost, even if he knew that the victory he had sought was an illusion, like smoke that dissipates, leaving only emptiness. He looked at the ashes, the black bones of the house, and whispered, "You were my home." He said it not to Rachel, not to Jerry, not to Trevor, but to the life he had lost, to the love he had failed to save, to the Mark Higgins who had once been an engineer fixing machines instead of a man ruining his own life. He said it to the ashes, to the wind, to the ring that might never have been Rachel's, but was now the only thing that connected him to the past. He didn't know what would happen next, whether Maura would come back with more questions, whether she would find the truth, whether Trevor would ask why his father had become a stranger. All he knew was that the ashes that surrounded him were not just the remains of his home, but of him, and those ashes would be with him forever, like a scar, like a memory, like Rachel's face in the flames. Mark stood up, clutching the ring in his fist, and walked away from the ashes, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of his fire on his shoulders. The wind was at his back, carrying the ashes away, but not his pain, his guilt, his love, which despite everything still smoldered in his heart like embers that the fire could not destroy. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that the ashes would be with him always, a reminder of what he had done, what he had lost, who he had become. And in that silence, in that wind, in those ashes, he heard only one thing: "You were my home." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.